Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7. Putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
The first crop of medical marijuana on the Lower Shore is coming soon. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. Company is called Shore Natural RX, and it's reported to be a $2 million renovation project complete with a greenhouse as well as areas for a laboratory, storage, and offices. In our studios this morning is Tim McGivern. He is one of the company's partners, and welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
So, well, let me ask you, first of all, how did you get into the idea of growing medical marijuana?
Well, my background has been in the industry for about 6 years now. So I first became involved with medical cannabis in New Mexico, in Albuquerque, New Mexico, back when it became legal in that state. As you know, the western states sort of have led the medical cannabis development in the nation. So once I did that for several years, became also associated with some old friends from the Eastern Shore that are native to the area that wanted to also explore the possibility of cultivating medical cannabis here. So we joined up several years ago, actually, far ahead in advance of the application process, and started getting educated. Learning the rules and regulations in the state, and then just preparing to apply for a license, and then ultimately we're granted one.
So what was your experience like out west?
Well, it was a little different than here because several years ago when it first started, we didn't really know exactly how the industry would evolve. The regulatory process was just kind of developing. So here I think it's a little more advanced and ahead of the curve of launching the industry. The regulatory process is a little more flushed out, I guess you could say. So when we started with the small program in New Mexico, we had limited plant counts. You could have 150 plants in your grow operation, and that gave us a chance to really kind of do the trial and error and learn as we went in a smaller operation, and then expand and make it scalable over time as the roles on of the patients grew. I think here, because it's been anticipated for such a while, there are many more patients waiting and that are going to need to be served kind of more quickly now.
What kind of demand did you find back out west?
Oh, it was tremendous, much more than I ever would have anticipated. Actually, once our dispensaries were open, and it was kind of surprising. You always knew that there was a demand for medical cannabis, right, for an opportunity to alleviate people's pain and suffering through an herbal remedy when other types of medicines and things weren't working, and to be able to obtain, organically grown, contaminant-free, third-party tested medicine is very different than any other form of access people had in the past, and so they really wanted that access. And then once you suddenly see the environment that you've created with people of all ages, anyone from a veteran with PTSD to a very aged, say, like your grandmother who has chronic pain, arthritic pain, coming in looking for medical, treatment that it helps them, and seeing how many people would benefit from it was kind of surprising. Not so much surprising, but just to the great extent that it was immediately on demand for. And the positive impacts and benefits it had even took me a little bit by surprise.
Did you have, by the way, any personal experience with other people who, for instance, you knew who took medical marijuana? Or is there a personal story here?
There wasn't when I started. There was really just my own knowledge and belief that, getting involved in this industry meant to me that I had the tools to make a difference. And I knew it would help alleviate people's pain and suffering in many ways. You know, we had 21 qualifying conditions. I mean, the whole reason that the program existed in New Mexico, just like it does here, is that testimony that we saw at the legislatures from the moms with their children with seizures that wanted treatment. You know, so you already knew that there were those stories. But once I got into it, that's when I realized from the personal stories started coming to me, more people that I knew that wanted to talk to me about their pain and suffering. And then my mother became a patient. She was suffering from shingles, and that led to some other chronic pain ailments and things like lack of sleep. And she was very, very reluctant to try medical cannabis. You know, she was lived a lifetime of, you know, what I would consider to be somewhat propaganda and misinformation about why you wouldn't want to use it as a medicinal treatment. So it took me a long time to get her to, you know, I wasn't certainly going to coerce her in any way, but I suggested maybe that might help. And after, you know, other conventional drugs weren't working for her, she did try a tincture format. Obviously, you know,
what's that?
A tincture is a concentrate. You know, it's certainly nothing that somebody would actually smoke. It's an extraction of oil-based concentrate that then is made into, well, it's actually, I think, a glycerin-based format that it can be ingested in the form of a dropper out of a small bottle. So, you know, you can put a tincture from a dropper into juice or, you know, water or seltzer water, something like that. That's how my mother administered it. And you know, I don't want to say it's a miracle drug in any way, but it helped her a lot. And so that was one incident for me that this was after I'd been in the industry for a while. So, I mean, I was pretty confident that I knew, of course, it wasn't going to have any kind of negative side effects to her, but that it would also help her. So, but more kind of in a more poignant way, you know, what really kind of hit home with me was when, you know, I was in the back of my office in the dispensary, and our manager came in and to my office and said, somebody wants to speak to you at the front. And of course, you can't get into the dispensary without showing your credentials as a patient as well as your ID. So I knew it was obviously a patient. So, you know, you kind of get a little sense of dread when someone says, hey, someone wants to talk to you. And you think, well, what went wrong? And it was a gentleman who just said, you know, I just wanted to thank you for what you're doing. You know, he was a veteran. He had served in Afghanistan, and he just was suffering severely with PTSD. And he said that coming to the dispensary was his 1 hour of the week that he got out of the house, and it wasn't really that comfortable for him yet to be in any kind of environment where he was around a lot of people and things, but that was one way he could get out and spend some time among people, and he would get his medicine. And he said, you know, I really appreciate that you're doing this. And again, this is you know, a few years ago, so it wasn't even really as widely kind of accepted already as it has become now. And he just said, you know, I appreciate what you're doing and doing this, because I know that it's controversial and highly regulated, and but it's making a difference. And, you know, to me, I felt like, you know, I'm not worthy. You know, how do I accept that and not, you know, feel like I'm honored to be able to reciprocate and help somebody. You know, so those are things that really make you realize on a daily basis when you're doing this that you do have the tools to make a difference. You know, and again, it's not just PTSD. That's just one very isolated example of what the medical cannabis can treat and how it can alleviate people's pain. It certainly helps in many, many other ways with, well, as we know, you know, what the qualifying conditions are in Maryland are pretty expansive.
So what has been the reaction to, say, the local community? Have they been welcoming? Have there been people who are skeptical about it? What's been your experience here?
I really haven't encountered any skepticism, to be honest with you. I mean, I don't deny or doubt that it's could be out there. I really don't know, but I can be very honest with you and tell you the response that I have received has been very positive. Folks have just told me, anecdotally, wherever it arises in conversation, that's what I do, that they're supportive of it. Yeah, it's really something that, I don't know, it almost feels like the best kept secret of, people aren't in really any great sense of denial, in my impression and observation, that it has its benefits. And so that I think that we're going to find, especially among the aged population, that they're going to want to try this medicine if they've been suffering some type of chronic pain that they've been treating conventionally for a long time and it hasn't really worked for them, and they've dealt with side effects, they've dealt with extreme costs, and especially when it comes down to sleep deprivation. That's something that is so common among our aged population, is that folks have a hard time sleeping. And you're not healing your body when you're not sleeping. That's when your body does heal. So then you have chronic pain throughout the day, and then you're not able to sleep at night. And it's just this spiraling type of process where I think people will look for other herbal remedies like medical cannabis that can really help them, starting with their sleep. There are types of cannabis that are more indica based. If you get into the science of cannabis, that can really help with sleep. And then that begins the healing process. And I think as we get older, we do just generally we've got a lot of miles on our body, and we need some pain relief that's just really side effect free. And so I think that we're going to see in the community where if we have populations like that, where over time there will be the early adopters, the pioneers, there will also be the skeptics, as you say, and the folks that are maybe just like my mom. It's been her whole life of something that didn't really resonate with her, so it's not going to be easy to get initiated to it. But it will serve its purpose for those that want to try it.
Most people are familiar with, say, for instance, the recreational use of marijuana. How does it compare, particularly in terms, obviously it's being prescribed or being recommended for a particular ailment, but beyond that, for people who are not familiar with it, how do you make those distinctions? What do you see the difference?
Well, medical cannabis, of course, is first of all highly regulated by the state. So, and then, when I talk about having the tools to make a difference, we applied for a license, and what our company, Shore Natural RX, does is we are certainly committed to organically grown, contaminant-free medicine. And we know that it's going to be third-party tested by certified labs in the state of Maryland. So there's a real science behind it, right? So you're going to be very mindful of the types of strains you're cultivating, where their genetics come from, how you created that genetic strain for specific medicinal purposes, and then, of course, how it's been grown. Obviously, these are people with compromised immune systems. They're infirm. They're not oftentimes people of means that are looking for the medicine, just like they're getting medicine from other sources. But here they're looking for something that's a real true alternative. And so we take all that into consideration and make sure that we're creating that medicine that serves that purpose. So that when you say adult use recreational, you're talking about perhaps, there's multiple kinds. There's two kinds. There's the kinds you can get if you're traveling in Colorado or Washington or Oregon, where you would go into a store and purchase it like you'd purchase a pack of gum if you're old enough, or someplace else where you would have to find it illicitly. And I can't speak to either one of those because that's not what I do.
Right.
Yeah.
So in terms of the strengths, the composition, THC, and so on, do you then have a variety of concentrations, or how do you do that?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. You do, there are two different types of profiles of cannabis that are grown. One's more of a sativa dominant, one's a indica dominant.
And
Okay,
what does
so
that mean?
sativa, well, there are two types of flowering plants that are both of the cannabis family, and then so indica dominant cannabis plants have kind of, you can see a picture of one versus the other, and I mean, in the interest of time, I would just say Google it.
Okay, go.
But indica dominant plants are more of a high desert origin. You go back thousands of years where they came from. Sativa plants are more coastal region, and so they do have different growth profiles in terms of what they look like, what their fan leaves are shaped like, what type of flower buds they produce, and then what the effects are. And so the science of this has been going on now for really accelerated since we've gotten into the medical legal markets, that growers will hybridize these two and get a plant that is a mixture of both. And then you look at those different strains and see how they have medicinal benefits. For example, one of the ways that we used to describe it in our dispensaries was indica means in the bed, and sativa is more sunrise. So if somebody has an inability to sleep, there's bad insomnia, maybe brought on by anxiety or whatever, they need something that's really going to calm them down. An indica-based flower would be more ideal, typically. Sativa would be something maybe somebody has the opposite. Maybe they have a difficulty, maybe they've got depression, or they've, and of course depression can always go with physical ailments as well. You have a bad back, it can make you depressed. If you get depressed, you can have suddenly back problems. Where you might need to get up and moving around, you do a sativa dominant profile on the plant. And you don't always have to smoke. As I said, obviously we're treating folks that are infirm, someone who's recovering from cancer, who needs the treatment, who has severe nausea, who has just severe pain. They're not going to be interested in smoking, inhaling any type of smoke in their body. So that's where the concentrates and tinctures and things like that come in. And the same thing, you can take a indica tincture or a sativa tincture.
Is it, by the way, in terms, just briefly there, so in terms of like the amount of the ingredients in any given dose or what you present, are there different levels of concentration of these particular elements, or go ahead?
Yeah, that's a really good question too, because it goes back to your point about the medicine. So yes, so it is properly dosed. So when we talk about being organically grown and third-party tested and safely handled, it also is about proper dosage. So with the testing that's done, you get the THC profiles. In other words, it'll tell you what percentage of THC is in it. So some strains might be very strong, very high THC content, some not so much so. So somebody wants a milder effect versus a stronger effect, depending on what kind of ailment they're trying to treat. You have that level of testing, and then you have the dosage. So I'm not a pharmacist, and also my license in Maryland is not actually as a dispensary. I've done that in other states. Here I'm just a cultivator, so we'd want to kind of, and that's why we have clinical directors associated with dispensaries, so all this stuff is also made sure that it's at the front line when they're dealing with patients. So I'm kind of giving some backstory to that. But you do have dosages in the milligrams. So, like a 10 milligram dosage of a concentrate would be what is recommended, and then folks would be able to tell if that's too weak or too strong and how to dose appropriately from that.
Let me finally, because I was talking, and we'll be talking momentarily with a doctor who's certified to recommend, as he says, cannabis. Is there any sense about what kind of dosage would be appropriate? And as I was talking to him, one of the things he said is that we don't really know a whole lot, and that one of his problems is that he's going to have to, he's only recommending, so he's not telling the patient what what kind of dosage, and that has to sort of be worked out with the people he sort of buys it with from, and anecdotal stories about it. I mean, so it's as I said to him, it's a very experimental stage in some ways, I think.
Well.
Or what do you think?
Well, somewhat, yeah. I mean, I see what your point is on that, and I think there's some important truth to that. Is that everything is good in moderation, right? Versus the opposite of excess is typically never really a great idea. So, I mean, the idea is that you start out in moderation, and it is true that as a medical cannabis patient for the first time. And again, remember, this is an herbal remedy. This is organically grown. It's safe. It's safely handled. It does not have any real negative side effects, in my opinion. Maybe somebody would perhaps disagree with me, but I would say that you're talking about something that it's non-addictive. Right. It has no real side effects. You can't overdose from it. So you can feel comfortable in moderation, learning how to get acquainted with the medical benefits of it. And so, things that are, like you said, it's a little different. It's a little more self-involved because you go to a dispensary and you want to try a certain different strain and you see something, oh, that's a little indica dominant, this is sativa dominant, I wonder which one I'll try. You have to do journaling. You have to try a dosage, make a note of it, see what the effects were, write down how you felt, how long it lasted, and sort of track that on your own. You have to do a little more of that as you become a medical cannabis consumer as a patient. Then you might want to think, oh, I'm just going to do every 4 hour 2 aspirin, and this is, right, and just accept it for what it is, and it may or may not even work for you. But so yeah, medical cannabis is a little more interaction with the experience.
We've been speaking with Tim McGivern. He is one of the partners of Sure Natural RX that will be growing medical marijuana here on the Eastern Shore. Appreciate you stopping by and chatting with us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks a lot for having me.
We now want to turn to Dr. Mitchell Gittleman. He has been certified to write recommendations for his patients to use medical marijuana. How did you get into being certified?
The process for doctors is actually very straightforward. It's a matter of going online to the Maryland Medical Cannabis website and registering as a physician. It takes about 10 to 15 minutes to just enter some general administrative information. And as long as no red flags show up, you get instant approval.
So what do you see as the benefits of cannabis, medical cannabis, as opposed to maybe other drugs or other things that you might use?
So for me, in my practice, when I find the right patient that I would consider recommending medical cannabis for, it would be for that person whose medical condition's not adequately treated with current modalities.
Such as?
I have a patient with metastatic lung cancer who takes lots of narcotics to treat the pain and has lots of side effects from the narcotics. And so this may be helpful to help treat pain and reduce the side effects from not taking as much in the way of narcotics. I have another patient with progressive multiple sclerosis who's wheelchair-bound, who has significant musculoskeletal problems. It would benefit them. I have a patient with post-traumatic stress disorder from being in the war, who's tried multiple antidepressants, anxiety medicines, and therapy, who has side effects from medication, who's not adequately treated from that. So the state of Maryland has provided a list of recommended conditions that doctors should consider when deciding whether or not to approve the recommendation for medical cannabis.
Are these generally very serious diseases that you're talking about, or are there some other ailments that may not be as serious but you might recommend?
It's going to be my policy, or it is my policy right now, that I'm reserving medical cannabis for those people with conditions that are not adequately treated with standard medical therapy.
Describe for us the difference between what, say, is medical marijuana as opposed to what a lot of people are familiar with, which is obviously recreational use. What is the difference? What are the effects on someone who takes it?
That's a great question. We don't know. Plain and simple, we don't know. And if you look historically at the history of medical cannabis, the drug was made Schedule I back in the 1920s. There really was no medical evidence to support making this a Schedule I drug. We could talk about the politics of that, some other time. But there's no medical research on cannabis. It's simply not there. And so it would be inappropriate, it would be unethical perhaps for me to try and convince somebody that there is, quote, medical cannabis, end quote, as if it's different from regular cannabis. The only true differences that I'm aware of, and it's just my opinion, is that the cannabis that's grown by the approved growers in Maryland and then processed by the approved processors in Maryland is that those are going to be checked for impurities and stability in those strains. And so for that person who's taking recreational cannabis off the street, friend, neighbor, family member, they may not know what they're getting from batch to batch, as opposed to the person that's going to go to a dispensary and presumably get the same strain with the same level of purity from the same grower and processor. So in that regard, I see a difference in potentially our level of knowledge about the different strains. In terms of the effectiveness for treating a medical condition, there is no medical information on that. It's simply not out there. I mean, our own congressman has co-sponsored legislation along with several others to try and get federal funding for medical cannabis research, which has never been available before. Do I think it's going to hurt people? Well, I can only say anecdotally that there's no long-term evidence that it's going to hurt people. There are several states in this country where it's already available recreationally. Several states in the country where it's available medically. There are no reported cases that I'm aware of death from cannabis use. There are side effects from it.
In terms of medical marijuana, how is it ingested?
So there are going to be various ways, I understand, that the processor or the growers' processors are going to get it to dispensaries. It could be inhaled. It could be liquid form. It could be baked into various foods. It could be applied topically. I don't believe it's going to be intravenously,
right.
But I think those are the most common ways you're going to be able to get it.
Many people associated with recreational marijuana obviously are connected with a particular kind of high.
Right.
Do the kind of amounts that we're talking about to treat people, does it move in that direction, or do we know yet?
Right. So in general, there are two main components to cannabis. There's THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, and CBD, cannabidiol. These are the two ingredients. It's the THC ingredient which produces the euphoria that people commonly associate with taking recreational cannabis. The degree or the amount, the percentage of THC in the various strains will vary. So if you go to the dispensary, they may have 10 bottles lined up, and on the bottles they should, I understand they'll be, and they're not open yet so we don't know for sure, but presumably if it's like the other states, they'll be labeled with 80% THC, 20% CBD, or 14% THC and 76%, 86% THC or CBD. So depending on the percentages of the various active ingredients, I believe logically would predict your degree of euphoria or sedation or potential side effects. But again, and this is important I think for your listeners to know, that there is no current medical evidence where a doctor can say to a patient, we know that if I give you cannabis at 75% THC, this will relieve your XYZ symptoms. We simply don't know that. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, it becomes a trial and error process. There are people that come to me and say, well, I've been using marijuana recreationally. I'd like you to, if you think it's appropriate, write the recommendation, which I may do. But then, again, the recommendation from a physician is simply a recommendation. For example, if I wrote a prescription for you for penicillin, I write on a piece of paper, penicillin, 500 milligrams, take it twice a day for 10 days. You take it to the pharmacy, and that's what the pharmacist fills. I know what I'm giving you. I know how much I'm giving you. I know how often you're taking it. When I write a recommendation for cannabis, I'm simply writing cannabis on a piece of paper, essentially. That's like me writing penicillin on a piece of paper and having you take it to the pharmacist and having the pharmacist say, oh, well, he wrote penicillin, so I'll make the decision as the pharmacist how much, how often to give it. So when a physician provides a recommendation For cannabis, the patient needs to understand that all I'm doing is saying, I think that you would potentially benefit from this for your medical condition. However, when you go to that dispensary, I have no idea what the people at the dispensary are giving you. I don't know if they're giving you a product that's got 80% THC or 20% THC. I don't know if they're giving it to you in an oil or in a cupcake or whether you're inhaling it. And there's no medical evidence to support a dispenser making a clinical decision about what form to give you. Now, are there plenty of blogs out there? Absolutely. Are there plenty of websites, and they're very sophisticated websites across the country about people that talk about their own personal experiences using cannabis to treat various conditions? A person might go, right, well, my 5-year-old has seizures, and we give my 5-year-old this product with 40% THC, and I mix 5 grains in, and I grind it up, and I melt it in with an oil, and then they get a dropper full every 4 hours, and it controls their seizures. And that's all well and good. But people need to understand this is anecdotal information provided by the general lay population. It's not a medical recommendation provided by a physician. So when people come to me, I make it clear that I'm providing a recommendation even though I can't provide strong medical evidence. When I provide that recommendation, it's because I think that they have a serious enough medical condition, back to your original question, that would make me feel as though the benefit would outweigh the risk. But then it becomes up to the consumer to make sure when they go back to that dispensary, are they going to get the same strain the next time? Is a dispenser going to be carrying the same strain the next time? If they have a side effect from this because it makes them too tired or it makes them feel paranoid, who do they talk to about that? They can't come to me. Well, they can come to me, but I'm not the one providing the actual product. So that's where the whole medical cannabis industry is really quite new in Maryland. Obviously, as you know, the product is still not on the shelf yet, or it's going to be very, very soon. So it's hard to know how this is going to fall out.
Would you, as a physician, keep track of any of the contents they do decide to get, or?
The Maryland law says that in order for a physician to write this, make this recommendation, we need to have an ongoing relationship with the patient. Now, some people may or may not take advantage of what the meaning of an ongoing relationship is. For me personally, if I were to write you a recommendation for medical cannabis, and keep in mind that the recommendation is good for 1 year. So you could potentially leave my office and never come back for 1 year and then want to get this refilled, and I have no idea what's going on with you. But I'm asking my patients, I'm requiring my patients that if I'm going to provide the recommendation, that they're going to follow up with me within a reasonable amount of time. That may be a week, it may be 2 weeks, it may be a month. And then I'm going to follow up with them to find out whether it's working for them. And then I'll have to learn from an anecdotal perspective, well, what's your experience been like? What strain of cannabis are you getting? What's the percentage of THC and CBD in your strain? How often are you using it? How is it being delivered to you? And perhaps I'm going to have to get an education simply by anecdotal experience with patients where I can say to future patients, well, I can't tell you that this is for sure based in medical literature and science that this is what you should be taking, but I can tell you from patients who have gone before for trying to treat the same condition that this has worked for them. You may want to use this as a springboard for how you make a decision if you want to go forward and use cannabis on your own.
So all of this seems to be very experimental, at least at this point, even though there are a number of states who certainly in the years past have certainly legalized medical marijuana, but it does seem as if it's all very experimental at this point.
Certainly for me, certainly in the state of Maryland. I know several other states have had it legalized. California, for example, medical marijuana has been legalized. But again, I don't know that there's been medical research that physicians who have written recommendations, you've got to be careful, it's not a prescription recommendation. I don't know that the physicians who have, for however many years now, California's been providing medical cannabis, have collated enough data to be able to provide, would be great. They could provide guidelines, at least guidelines. And to my knowledge, guidelines do not exist. And so it becomes a challenge. It's a new frontier.
Dr. Mitchell Gittleman, a doctor in Salisbury who's been certified to write recommendations for his patients for medical marijuana. This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for watching Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Production and audio engineering by Chris Frank. Hosted by Don Rush. For podcasts, visit delmarvapublicradio.net or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on Pack 14.